Okay, so what I want to think about just for a moment from this passage is communicating the good news to different people. Communicating the good news to different people. Sorry, there's a spelling error on there. I'll change that because some people won't be able to listen through the offence that's causing them. There we go. So that's corrected. You can now relax and cope with the message. Okay, so let's just quickly remind ourselves where we are. And we have Paul and Barnabas sent out from Antioch. That's a significant step away from Jerusalem. It means that the gospel has spread now through Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and is beginning to go to the Gentiles, to the ends of the earth. Paul and Barnabas have been sent from Antioch, and they've gone to Cyprus, traveled across the island, speaking of Jesus, and then sailed up to Pamphylia, to Perga in Pamphylia, and then traveled to Antioch. And now they're coming across at the start of our chapter to Iconium, and they're going to be ministering in Lystra and Derbe. So this is the big push in the book of Acts to get the gospel to the Gentiles. It took a huge amount of the Spirit's work to thrust Peter out to Cornelius' house. There was a huge obstacle to overcome, which Martin helped us to look at over the last couple of Sundays. And now Paul and Barnabas are out speaking to the Gentiles. That's the aim of their mission in this section of the book of Acts. So that's the context and where they are. But their pattern throughout all those places they've been to as they go to the synagogue first. And in the synagogues, they would find Jews, not surprisingly, but also God-fearing Gentiles. And as they would go to the synagogues, they would speak of Jesus. Look at verse 1, and you see that at Iconium, in the Jewish synagogue, they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believe. So what you need to understand is that the Jews themselves have been on mass mission over recent decades, and the Jews are spread throughout the Roman Empire, and wherever they've gone, they've been trying to win Gentiles to the Jewish faith. And so in the synagogues, there are people who are ethnically Jews, but also God-fearing pagans, people who are still Gentiles, but who've come to the synagogue to learn of the Jewish God. And Paul and Barnabas preached so effectively in the synagogue there in Iconium that a great number of people believe. A large number of disciples are made. But as is the pattern, as we're beginning to see too, those Jews who don't accept Jesus as the Messiah, don't accept that Jesus is the Messiah that they're waiting for, are not happy with Paul and Barnabas. And so they drive them out of the town. And so they have to move on. And this is a bit of a pattern. It's happened as well in Antioch. And so we're going to see this as a bit of a pattern that they're going to the synagogues where people are waiting for the Messiah. They're announcing Jesus as the Messiah. Numbers will believe, but those who don't react negatively and push them out. And so they continue to preach the gospel then as they go through into a place called Lystra and into Derbe. But what's fascinating is there doesn't seem to be a synagogue in Lystra. We're not told of one. We're not told that they went to the synagogue there. So it doesn't seem as though they're able to repeat their pattern. And what happens in Lystra is markedly different from the other places that they go to. Can you see there in verse 8? In Lystra, there sat a man who was lame. He'd been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. Now, actually, that should ring bells, because it's very similar to a miracle that Peter performed in Acts chapter 3. And it's worth just flicking back to Acts chapter 3, because you can see the contrast in the places that they are visiting between what happens in these two incidents. So back in Acts chapter 3, at the temple, Peter has seen a lame man, and he's in the name of Christ told him to get up, and the man has got up and has walked and praising God. And you'll see towards the end of Acts chapter, in verses 9 to 13 of Acts chapter 3, that the people are filled with wonder and amazement at what happened to him. And in response, Peter and John then say, fellow Israelites, why does this surprise you? Why do you stare at us as if by our own power or godliness we made this man walk? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus. And off he goes. He's into the gospel. He's up and running with the good news about Jesus, in whose name he has healed this lame man. And by Acts chapter 4 and verse 4, the end of the incident, many who heard the message believed. So the number of men who believed grew to 5,000. So in Jerusalem, to a Jewish audience, Peter performs a miracle where a lame man is made to walk. He gets straight into the good news about Jesus, linking it into the Old Testament, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and our fathers. And by the end of the incident, Acts 4 verse 4, many heard the message and believed. What's the response in Lystra? Come back to Acts chapter 14. What's the response in Lystra? Peter says to this man, get up and walk. Verse 11, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in human form. It's a completely different context. It's a completely different audience. And whereas Peter is able to go from the miracle in the name of Jesus straight to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and on to Jesus Christ, the Messiah, Paul has a problem. Because the crowd in Lystra think that their gods have come in human form. Now, there's some important background we need to know about the local area here. About 50 years before this incident, the Latin poet Ovid had narrated in one of his works an ancient local legend. In the legend, Zeus and Hermes, or as he was writing in Latin, Jupiter and Mercury, had once visited this area, disguised as mortal men. And in disguise, they sought hospitality. But they were rebuffed 1,000 times. No one would welcome them. Until eventually they're offered lodging in a tiny cottage, thatched with straw and reeds from the marsh. And an elderly peasant couple called Philemon and Baucis live there, and they entertain their gods. And later the gods reward them for their hospitality, but destroy by flood the homes of everyone who wouldn't take them in. This is a local legend. Actually there is there are inscriptions and a stone altar near Lystra, which indicate that Zeus and Hermes were worshipped together as local deities. So there's this strong legend of being punished for not welcoming the gods in human form. Paul and Barnabas come in, perform this miracle, and the local people, because of their local knowledge and understanding of myths, immediately believe that the gods have come in human form, and they rush out, can you see, to welcome them. And verse 13, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. Can you see what's happened here? Because of what they understand of the world, as they see this miracle, they interpret it in their own knowledge. They respond to the power of Jesus with the background knowledge that they bring. They assume it's their gods come to the world in human form. Now, Paul and Barnabas, understandably, are horrified when they discover what's happening. And actually, it seems as though it took a little longer to understand what was happening because the people were speaking in a local dialect, which Paul and Barnabas didn't understand. Now, as Paul sees their mistake, where's he going to go? How's he going to speak into this situation? Peter, back in Jerusalem, went straight to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then on to Jesus. Well, Paul can't do that. These people aren't Jewish by background. They don't have a knowledge of the Old Testament. They don't know the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Paul, can you see in verses 15 to 17, says to them, stop doing this. We're mortal men like you. We're bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things, myths about the gods coming in human form, to the living God. Now, how is he going to introduce this living God? Bear in mind that these local people believe in lots of gods, a pantheon of gods, little gods. Well, Paul says, let me tell you, he's the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their way, yet he's not left himself without testimony. He's shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your heart with joy. Paul's recognizing what's going on. These folks have got no Bible knowledge. They've seen the miracle they've done and drawn completely the wrong conclusions. And Paul is having to speak into that situation. And so he says to them, look, don't be silly believing in these gods, the pantheon of gods, those myths and legends. No, we're bringing you good news about the real God, the living God. But where do you start? Well, he's conscious for folks like these that they're very aware of a world that is created. They're very aware of a world around them that is dependent on the God, or the gods in their understanding. They recognize that there is spiritual intervention in their world, and so Paul is able to point them to the living God who made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them. Able to point them to the God who has shown his kindness by giving them rain from heaven and crops in their season, giving them plenty of food and filling their hearts with joy. He taps into something they do understand, something they do know, something they do believe, and goes from there to point them to the one true God, and calls them to leave behind the worthless stories that they're following. The trouble is, can you see the result? He has a real problem trying to contain the crowd and their excitement. With these words, he's struggling to contain them. Verse 18, even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. So strong is their local belief, so fearful are they of the legends, that they want to press on and sacrifice and honor Paul, sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas, and honor them. And so Paul is really battling with their misunderstanding as he's trying to get to speak about Jesus. And then sadly, before he can move on, and he's struggling to connect with them here, in verse 19, we're told that a bunch of Jews turn up and win the crowd over. Now look at where these Jews have come from Antioch and Iconium. Just quickly go back to the map. Some of them have traveled from Antioch to Lystra. That's 100 miles. These folks are pretty opposed to the gospel. These folks are pretty determined that the news about Jesus is not spread. They've joined with Jews from Iconium to come to Lystra, and they turn the crowd against Paul. And very quickly, the crowd go from wanting to honor Paul and Barnabas to throwing them out of the city and stoning them and leaving them as dead. So Paul's struggled to communicate with this crowd, and now he's lying as dead outside the city, and they've rejected him and his message. Now contrast that to chapter 14, verse 1. Speaking in the Iconium synagogue, a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. Then come down to verses 21 and 22, where they get to Derbe, and there they preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. But here, they've really struggled to connect. Now, I think there's something going on here that we know, but we need to apply afresh to ourselves. We need to speak the gospel with an understanding of who our audience are and where they're coming from, and understand that there will be a different speed of take-up depending who we're speaking to. You'll know the stories of William Carey, who went to India, and it was 7 years before his first convert. He was speaking to people who had no knowledge of the Bible, no knowledge of the stories of who God is, who worshipped many gods. And therefore, William Carey had to spend a lot of time winning their trust, understanding their culture, seeking to work out how to communicate the gospel, the Bible stories to them, to bring them to Jesus. It was a long time before they came to understand about Jesus. When people don't have that background and that knowledge and that privilege, we've got to speak into a worldview that is very, very different. And I think it's fascinating here that in these verses within Acts 13 and 14, we've got very different descriptions of the missionary work. Back in 13 verse 48, we're told that all those who were appointed for eternal life believed. A verse that makes it very clear that salvation is God's work. God has elected a people to be saved, and he saves them. But at the same time, in chapter 14, verse 1, we're told that they spoke so effectively. And in chapter 14, verse 21, they preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. Acts points to both the sovereign intervention of God, but also the human ability to communicate the message, to speak effectively, to win over, to explain, to help people to understand. And I think we need to have a think about this in terms of our own culture today, because we need to think about who we're speaking to and how we point them to Jesus. It's a good question, isn't it? What testimony would you give today to the God who is there? Paul, to the folks in Lystra, goes to the creator God, the God who gives them the seasons, the God in charge of the weather, the God in charge of the harvest. He knows they can connect with that they'll understand that. But actually, if you speak to the average person about that in our culture today, they're so convinced of Darwinian evolution that they won't have any time for that. How do we connect with our culture today to point them to the reality of God? Where is God's testimony to them? Where can they see it? So that's the first question, really. The second thing is that Paul calls them to turn from their false gods, these worthless gods, Zeus and Hermes, to the living God. What is it that we're calling people to turn from today? What are the worthless things that people are following in our culture? And I think what's complex in our world today is that there's no one answer to those questions. There have been times in history, and there still are in parts of the world, where a whole culture believes the same thing. And so the answer is believed by everybody. But our culture now is so multi-ethnic, so intergenerational, different generations, so many different cultures swirling around, access to so many ideas through the internet, that actually it's very difficult to try and discern where people are coming from, what they do believe, what they are following. And so I think actually for us today, we have a real job to do in terms of listening to what people are saying, listening for clues as to what they do believe, what they are trusting in, how they might see God, the real God in this world. We're going to need to ask questions. We're going to need to probe to learn to be able to point people to Jesus effectively in our culture and society. Now, it's very interesting. On Sunday mornings in South Craven, last year, we used Life Explored. And I had quite a lot of response from our church folks. They didn't like it. At least a few people said, I much prefer Christianity Explored. Straight to Jesus, straight to the cross, much clearer. Now, the reason that Rico Tice and others have produced not just Christianity Explored, but now Life Explored, is because as they've been sharing Christianity Explored, they found the majority of people in our culture are not yet ready to listen to Jesus. They're not yet ready for Christianity Explored. Actually, there's work to be done to understand what they are thinking, to try and find out where they are itching, to try and see what they are wrestling with, to tap into those things, to point them to God, which is what Life Explored does. Now, the trouble is, for us as Christians, that's really uncomfortable. Because we like Christianity Explored. It's biblical. It gets straight to the cross. It's into Jesus. And that's great for us because we've got, most of us, a massive background in the Bible. But for the average Joe on the streets, that's not the case. And so there's work to be done. And so actually follow through in Acts. It's very interesting, the messages that we see that Paul preaches. In chapter 13, Luke records Paul's message in the synagogue. Chapter 14, Luke records Paul's message to pagan worshippers. In chapter 17, he's going to record Paul's message to the philosophers. Now, why does Luke record those three messages? Why only one of each? I think he's trying to give us samples of seeing how Paul operates, to work out how to communicate the gospel to those around him who are not yet saved. Sorry, I'm getting very excited by this. I'm also losing my voice, but I need to stop there because we've got more to come afterwards. But that's what I want you to just think about and perhaps make a note on and have a think about this week. What can we point people to today as a testimony to the reality of God? What would connect with the people that we're speaking to? And that will be different to the different people you speak to. And secondly, what worthless things are we calling people to turn from to the living God? What is it that people are following or committed to in our society around? And that will be different for the different people you speak to. Right, let's have a breather. No, it's not a breather, is it? Let's sing and remind ourselves of the great rescue of God from the depths of shame and sorrow, how he saved us. Let's sing this psalm together. Okay, we're going to turn to the second half of our reading, and Anne is going to kindly read that for us. Thank you, Anne. Acts 14, 21 to 28.
They preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. After going through Pisidia, they came into Pamphylia, and when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. From Attalia they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work they had now completed. On arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they stayed there a long time with the disciples.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, so let's turn to this second section, and I want us to see the theme of strengthening the disciples. And let's just go to the map again. And so Paul has come from Antioch, across Cyprus, up into Pamphylia, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. Now look how close he is to getting back to Antioch. And look at the town on his way. It's Tarsus. Now this is Saul of Tarsus. This is Paul of Tarsus. That's his hometown. But Paul doesn't go on to Tarsus and Antioch. He gets to Derbe, and then he goes back. Why doesn't he complete the loop? Why doesn't he carry on doing the circle? I don't know about you, but I much prefer round walks rather than there and back again. It's much nicer to have a change of scenery, isn't it? And to do it all the way around. But Paul gets so far round and then turns and comes back again. Now, we're not told exactly why he did that, but we see what he did as he did it. Can you see in chapter 14 and verse 21? Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. So Paul and Barnabas now have been sent out to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Their pattern has been to go to the synagogues, where they find God-fearing Gentiles as well as the Jews. When they're in the synagogues, they summarize the Old Testament story, get to the end where the Jews are still waiting for the Messiah, and then they say, he's here, it's Jesus. Let's tell you about it. He's the one who has come and died and risen again, and in him is forgiveness of sins, a forgiveness that you couldn't know through the Mosaic law. That's the message in the synagogue. And then as they are confronted with the Gentiles, with no Jewish background, they point to the God who's made the world and provides the rain and the sunshine and the things that grow, as they try to begin that journey of pointing them to the Messiah. And as they've gone round and seen disciples, people profess faith, make disciples made in each of these places, then are going back to the towns where they won disciples to strengthen them. And it's interesting how he does that. And there's a lesson for us to learn here. How is it that Paul strengthens the disciples? Well, in a parallel term to strengthening them as disciples, we have this phrase that he encouraged them to remain true to the faith. Paul goes back to the people he's spoken to and reminds them of the faith that he has taught them. All the way through the New Testament, there is an understanding that there is a body of truth about Jesus that is the faith. It's clearly identified, it's clearly summarized. You can draw it out of the letters, you can draw it out of the preaching. This is Jesus, who is God, who has come and lived a perfect life and died on the cross, bearing our sins, and was buried in the ground and rose again on the third day, who's going to return one day. And we need to turn to him, to trust in him, and follow him, to follow his instructions, everything he's taught us until he returns. That's a very brief summary of that faith, but it's clearly identifiable. And Paul then is able to go back to these disciples and remind them of the truth that he's taught them and encourage them to remain true to it. They've got to commit themselves to this truth. They've got to commit themselves to this faith. And he encourages them to do that. That's how he's strengthening these disciples. But alongside that, he warns them that hardship is coming. That actually they're going to have to go through much hardship to enter the kingdom of heaven. Can you see in verse 22? When I was in my first year at university, I was involved in a group of students who preached in the open air on campus and went door to door to talk to people about Jesus. And I was asked to take on leadership of this group at the end of my first year, I think. And the next freshers event, we had a table with everybody else and we welcomed new people, and then we had our first event of the evening. And I spent the whole event talking about all the encouragements we'd had in the previous year, speaking about Jesus. And after about 10 minutes of raving about all these encouragements, one of the committee members nudged me and said, "Paul, don't you think you ought to tell them all the difficult things as well?" Now, the truth was, I just had in my mind that anybody signing up for open air preaching and door to door knew that it was really difficult. I assumed I didn't need to give them any warning at all. Actually, I thought that would put people off, and so I was trying to encourage them. But actually, the committee member was right. I was being imbalanced. I needed to warn people of the difficulties and hardships of speaking to people about faith. And Paul is very clear here with the disciples. He's reminded them of the body of truth, encouraged them to remain true to it. But he says to them, actually, to get to that kingdom, there's a lot of hardship ahead. There are going to be all sorts of difficulties. They crucified the Messiah, and they will reject all those who follow him. And so he warns them of the hardships before they come into the kingdom of God. He's realistic, he's honest, he's true about the difficulties. And so this is how to speak to the disciples, how to strengthen them, to remind them of the faith that they're to be committed to, and to prepare them for the hardships so that they're battle ready, if you like. But then they do something else. They appoint elders in each of the churches. It's plural in each of the settings. Local leaders, local shepherds to care for and teach and lead at those congregations. So as well as the members, the individual believers and corporately together having a clear grasp of the faith and being warned about the hardships, leaders are appointed to lead them and guide them and care for them in each local setting. And so that's the second strand to making sure that the disciples are strengthened, that there are elders in those churches. And then thirdly, he commits them to the Lord. It's very clear, isn't it, that it's Christ's church, that it belongs to God, that salvation is a work of God's grace, that growth is a work of God's grace. And so Paul commits these folks to the Lord, in whom they've put their trust. As it were, leaves them in God's hands. And then he goes back home as he's dotted round back on the map to each of the places he's been, speaks to the disciples there, encourages them in their faith, warns them about the hardships, appoints elders, commits them to the Lord. And finally, he gets back to Antioch, back to the church that sent him out, back to the church that has been praying for him, back to the church where he pastored himself for some time, to report, can you see, all that God had done through them, to tell them all the things that God had been doing through them as they've spoken of Jesus. And what's fascinating is the headline is how the Lord has opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, verse 27. Now, how would you reflect on that as a summary? I think it's a fascinating phrase, isn't it? That he's opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, because Paul's ministry has been to go to the synagogues, to speak to the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, to begin to establish, as it were, gospel bridgeheads into those Gentile communities. But we've not seen floods of Gentiles being saved necessarily. Some in each area, yes. But it's a door of faith that's been opened to them. The work is beginning. I wonder if you were the sending church and you'd commissioned Paul to go to the Gentiles, and he came back after some time saying, well, I've preached in all the synagogues, and the Jews have keep throwing me out. Would you be questioning his strategy? Would you be asking what he's playing at? That's not who you sent him to. Would you be willing to send him again? Well, of course they did, and they recognized the wisdom of what he'd been doing, and they greatly rejoice in all God is doing and God has done. But how can we learn from this today? And again, I think there are some lessons we need to learn. There's a very clear pattern here, which is very helpful for us, about strengthening the disciples by pointing them to the faith and ensuring they got a grasp of it, and encouraging them to be committed to it, warning of the hardships, making sure there's local leadership, committing to the Lord. But just reflect for a moment about the speed at which Paul does that. He's able to go to a community, preach in the synagogue. It doesn't seem that he's there for many more weeks before he's thrown out. And he comes back and he says, right, let's appoint some elders. And after this first missionary trip, he leaves behind complete churches, independent churches. In fact, within the space of 10 years, Paul establishes churches in 4 of the provinces of the empire: Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia, and Asia. Before AD 47, there were no churches in those provinces. By AD 57, Paul could speak as though his work had been done there. There's churches all over that area. Now, how does it happen so quickly? How is it that Paul can go back and appoint elders in those places? Now, I think this is important again to understand the context in which Paul is ministering. You see, actually, all of those communities Paul was going to, there were Jewish and God-fearing converts who already had a strong Old Testament background in the doctrine and ethics of the Judeo-Christian heritage. In fact, Judaism was the first great missionary religion within the Mediterranean world. There had been a period of unparalleled missionary activity. And in consequence, these Christian missionaries, Paul and Barnabas, as they go out, find proselytes and God-fearers as well as the Jews everywhere they go. And so, in a sense, the overwhelming success of the mission of the Apostle Paul, who in the space of 10 years has established centers of Christian faith throughout almost the whole of the contemporary world, is resting on the fact that he was able to build on the ground prepared by that Jewish mission. In fact, Acts 2 tells us that Jews from these areas were in Jerusalem when Peter preached at Pentecost. So some of them not only had the background of the Old Testament, they also had the good news of the gospel in Jesus Christ, and they were there before Paul. It's very doubtful that within a few months, Paul could have appointed elders in a congregation composed entirely of ex-pagans and ex-idolaters, with no background Bible knowledge, with no understanding of the ethics of the God of Israel. And I think that's an important lesson for us to learn today, again, in our context. As we think about planting, as we think about church growth in our setting, how we strengthen disciples, we need to be aware of the culture in which we are operating. And I think we need to be very sensitive to how the Lord is leading and how the Lord is helping us to understand how we apply the principles to the context in which we are. See, what sort of climate are we in? White Anglo-Saxons are the most resistant culture to the gospel on the planet. Many of our fellow countrymen know nothing of the Bible and its ethics, or they believe the Bible and its ethics to be evil and wicked. That's the culture we're beginning to be more and more involved in. The average gospel church in the UK is growing at about 1%. A lot of the rapid growth that you see in churches is just a shuffling of the pack. It's Christians being drawn from other churches, young people moving into the university towns, or people from overseas who are already Christians coming. So as we think about planting a church in Keighley, and we're grateful for all that we've seen with Emmanuel getting started. As we think about the needs in Skipton and Colne, we need to think about the context in which we're operating and the speed at which things will happen. If the average church is growing at about 1%, Emmanuel might see one convert every 4 years. And some of those may well be the church kids. So we need to understand that the ground we're planting into and our expectations in the way that God is working at the moment as to how things will take. I think we need to understand too that in our society at the moment, churches are required to register as charities, and therefore there needs to be a certain amount of administrative clarity sorted. And so it's actually very difficult to start churches because of what's expected. So how do we move forward in our context to make sure that disciples are strengthened and churches are planted with a clear gospel understanding, with local leadership? And we need to be careful, I think, of two mistakes. One of the mistakes of British mission in overseas territories has been an inability to let the locals lead. Not in a rapid, after 6 months, but after 60 years. After hundreds of years, there's still no locals leaded. There's been a dependent culture on the white British missionaries, which has been wrong. It's been a lack of willingness to let go. But I fear in our context today, our bigger problem is impossible expectations of church plants. Part of the problem is we hear of a lot of church plants in the university cities where big church sends out 30 and they grow to 100 and then they plant again. And we rejoice that there are conversions in that. But the story you're not hearing is that all the little churches around the country are sending their members to that university. They're attending those churches and they're joining that church plant. And also some of those churches are in bigger population areas where there are people from other cultures which are more open to the gospel. If you want a growing church in the UK, having Chinese and Iranians is wonderful because they are responding. They are open to the gospel at the moment. And so I think there are lessons to learn about how we go about church planting and understanding the environment we're operating in. And I think the big lesson in all of this is partnership. It's not dependence, but neither is it quick to independence either. Ongoing partnership. And I just want to share quickly a model that another church that's in a similar setting to ours has put together. This is Grace Church in Boroughbridge, and their vision for the Vale of York. They are committed to growing by planting new churches. Their vision is to see communities of light scattered across the villages and towns between the Yorkshire Dales National Park and the North York Moors National Park, especially the area between the A1, A19, A168 and A59. So like us, they've got a church in a particular town and they're concerned that the gospel spreads to other communities around them. So here is their vision. They want to see individuals and families who are part of Grace Church in Boroughbridge witnessing to Christ in their villages So like us, they've got people coming in from outlying areas into their church in their community. And they want those people in their own communities to be witnessing to Christ, in the hope that they will become gospel communities in their villages, which attend Grace Church in Boroughbridge on Sundays. Now, their language of gospel communities would be equivalent to our life groups. They want to see a small group of believers then in that village worshipping together, but still coming to the main town for Sundays, in the hope that they become gospel communities meeting every Sunday in their villages, which are resourced by Grace Church in Boroughbridge. So now they've grown from being a home group in the middle of the week to a congregation on a Sunday, but still resourced by the parent church, in order that they can become a self-sustaining church with a vision for church planting. Now, there's a sense in which when Paul did this, he was able to go, preach the gospel, move on, come back, establish a church and move back. And he got from stage 1 to 4 very quickly. The key thing here is that Boroughbridge are saying that they're happy for groups to remain at stages 2 or 3. Midweek home group, Sunday congregation dependent on the main congregation, because that may be appropriate in their context. But they're also open to gospel communities becoming self-sustaining churches which are independent of us. We want to be open-handed. As church leaders, we long to see independent churches planted in Keighley, Skipton, Colne and beyond, but the speed at which that happens the journey that takes, the stages we're going to have to go through may take some time, and it's helpful to have that pattern. So at the moment, we rejoice that Emmanuel, which started as a home group, is now meeting on Sundays, but is dependent on us, and we hope that they will become independent. But how quickly that happens, we'll need to think through. We'll need to think through the reality of local leadership. We'll need to think through the reality of being able to become a charity and all the regulation that comes with that in our context. And we'll need to think through how we can continue to partner even after independency. So just some things to think through in terms of the pattern and the priorities, but also the context and the complexities.